is on that individual. And it moves into the realm of hifz. Not the isma, because the isma is for the prophets alone. They have impeccability, they cannot fall into error, but there is a type of protection as an individual moves higher and higher into that realm of purity of the self. Now, if you move, and I could go, but the time is limited, if you move to, you can go into nafs, hawa, dunya, shaitan, the enemies of the human being. But I want to go a little bit into the material world now. Looking at we have to understand that that's there, and it's important because we're not materialists. You see, the materialists, if you read Montgomery Watts, who's a Christian, he should know better, but he doesn't. Montgomery Watts, in a book he wrote on Spain, he says, and when these Muslim hordes came over, he might not use that word, but when these Muslims came over, their main goal, and I'm paraphrasing, their main goal was conquest. You see, and they wanted booty. Now, were you there, Mr. Watts? No, seriously. Did you know the intentions of all of those people? Or are you simply making an analogy of the people that you know? Or maybe your own self? You see, this is how the materialist interprets it. And the munafiq is similar to that. When Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anhu and Abdurrahman bin Auf brought in, one brought gold for the ghazwa and the other brought dates. The munafiqun said, Abdurrahman yura'i, he wants to show off. And they said about Abu Dhar, he wants to be mentioned. This is a disease in the heart. You see, in other words, they are projecting their own diseased hearts onto pure human beings whose intentions were Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger. They were not diseased people. By the shahada of the Prophet himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were not diseased. But they are being considered as having these ulterior motives, axes to grind, because those very people with those motives are projecting their own internal reality onto the internal reality of these other people, and it's not applicable. Because we do not have that. أُمِرْتُ أَنْ أَحْكُمْ بِالظَّوَاهِرِ, I was commanded to judge by the outward. أَشَقَقْتَ عَنْ قَلْبِهِ, did you split open his heart and look into it? When Usama killed the man who said La ilaha illallah, and he said قَدْ نَافَقَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ, he was doing it out of hypocrisy. أَشَقَقْتَ عَنْ قَلْبِهِ, did you split open his heart and look into it? And in another riwayah he kept repeating to him, and he said, La ilaha illallah, until Usama said, I wish that I hadn't became a Muslim until that day. You see, and so this is how the Prophet ﷺ was teaching his people. That intentions are Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's alone. Now we can see signs of a munafiq. We can see signs of a munafiq. You see, Allah has given us signs of hypocrites. They have signs. But to judge a person is a very dangerous thing to do. To judge their intentions. And this is what the materialist does. So we have to recognize these other forces, these other realities that the materialist will not look at, because he only knows the outward of this world. Now, when we move to the material, we have to keep the spiritual in mind. But when we move to the material, we also have two forces working, external and internal. In other words, the material, there are causes that I'm not relating to the unseen world, but I'm relating to the seen world, but there are signs and there are also symptoms. And the symptoms we do not know unless they are articulated by the very people that are involved in the matter. So we do not know. Now, in looking at the material, we have two important things to look at. One is kufr itself. And the Prophet ﷺ has said, Al-kufr millatun wahida. Kufr is one system. It is one millah. All of kufr is one millah. You have the Marxists, the atheists, the communists, the socialists, the national socialists, international socialists, the capitalists, the free market capitalists, the American anti-NAFTA, anti-GATS capitalists, all different types of capitalists, ultimately one phenomenon called kufr. It's all kufr. It goes under the rubric of kufr, but it has different permutations. And you can see syphilis, very interesting disease. One of the doyens of medicine in the 19th century said, no syphilis in all of its manifestations, and you've mastered 80% of pathology. Because syphilis is called the great mimicker. And the syphilis can look like a lot of different diseases. And this is a syphilitic culture, right? Really, they had syphilis. They all, you know why they wear wigs, right? You see all these pictures of men in wigs. And you know, what cultures had men wearing wigs? Their hair was all falling out. They had syphilis. Really, that's what happened. And then the scrofulas. You said they had syphilitic scrofulas, so they started wearing these high collars, very uncomfortable, to hide the syphilis. It was a very common disease in Europe. I'm not exaggerating this. It still is. It's just all gone underground in this culture. They call it AIDS now, right? I mean, AIDS is, if you look at AIDS and study AIDS, it looks exactly like syphilis in fast motion. Seriously. I mean, a physician will confirm that for me. They have AIDS dementia. The first thing, they break out in rashes, right? And then later on they go into dementia, which is tertiary syphilis. And interesting to note that community that AIDS began first showing up in, the first signs of it, homosexual community, was a community constantly exposed to syphilis and rectal gonorrhea. So in fact, you can see the statistics of the public health in the Bay Area. It's very, very disgusting. It's all part of their culture. So you have the point I'm using about syphilis as a grotesque example, but syphilis mimics a lot of different things. It can look very different. It's still syphilis. And the same is true with what Nietzsche called syphilization, right? It looks very different, but ultimately it's kufr. So the Eastern Bloc looks different from the Western Bloc. It's still kufr. Now, if we study kufr, and it's an important study because Allah spends a good deal, tells us, not stuff that Allah does not spend, but tells us in the Quran, much of the Quran is in explaining kufr so that we can understand it. Now, if you look at kufr, the European kufr is very different from other kufrs in that the Europeans have a deep agitation for centuries. And that agitation, Allah Ta'ala alam, relates to the fact that they had partial truths mixed with a lot of pseudo-truth, things that appear to be true. Their religion was tainted from very early on. Their books were altered from very early on. Now, if you look at the Christian text, the very first Christians were called Nazarenes by their own testimony. They're called, according to the Quran, Nasara. Now, they're finally realizing, and they actually realized all this in the 19th century, but now they're starting to sell books about it in places like Barnes & Noble after nobody can read, right? See, now they can just, you can go get all the information about what they're doing, about their kufr, everything. You can go get it now because nobody's going to read it because they're all watching TV. So it works. They can tell us the whole story. If you look at a book that Hans Kuhn did called Christianity and the World Religions, Kuhn writes, admittingly, current research would indicate that any direct dependency of Islam upon Jewish Christianity, and you see they're admitting there was something called Jewish Christianity, and that was the first Christianity of whatever sort, because there were various types even early on, will continue to be disputed for a while. In other words, we're trying to find the direct dependency. So it's in dispute right now because they have absolutely not one shred of evidence But they do not, and I'll get to the reason why he has to say this, because it's a very important point he's making. We simply know too little about the Arabian Peninsula in those centuries before the Prophet Muhammad. That's rubbish. It is not true. But the analogies are as astonishing as ever. In other words, between Islam and original Christianity, because we believe that it was Islam. This is what he's telling us. And this is very important because this man is one of the dominant theologians of this age for the Christians, even though he's basically excommunicated by the Catholic Church because he's just telling the truth, and the truth destroys the foundations of the Catholic Church. It's a big problem. Even if we could never scientifically verify a genetic connection